The earth trembled beneath Willow Anderson's feet as she ventured deeper into the Silver Peak mine, her lantern casting eerie shadows against the rough-hewn walls. It was 1876, and despite the protests of the men who worked these treacherous tunnels in Silver Creek, Colorado, she was determined to document the conditions for her father's newspaper. "Miss Anderson, we really shouldn't be this far in," called Silas, the elderly mine foreman who'd reluctantly agreed to escort her. "These supports ain't been checked proper in weeks." Willow brushed a strand of auburn hair from her face, the heat and dust making her skin glisten despite the cool underground air. At 24, she'd developed a reputation for stubbornness that matched her father's, a trait that had served her well as one of the few female journalists in the territory. "Just a few more minutes, Mr. Silas. Father's exposé on the Blackwater Mining Company needs something substantial." She raised her notebook, scribbling observations by the flickering light. "The town deserves to know what these men endure." For a low, ominous rumble interrupted her words. Dust sifted down from above, dancing in her lantern light. "Miss, we need to go now." Silas grabbed her arm, urgency in his weathered face. They had taken only 3 steps when the world exploded around them. The sound was deafening, wood splintering, rock grinding against rock, men shouting in the distance. Willow felt herself thrown forward as Silas pushed her ahead with surprising strength. She stumbled, fell, and rolled against a wall as a cascade of timber, rock, and earth crashed down behind her. When the dust settled enough to see, Willow realized with horror that a wall of debris separated her from both Silas and the exit. The small pocket where she'd landed was intact, but she was completely sealed in. "Silas," she cried, her voice breaking through coughs. "Silas, can you hear me?" Only silence answered. The lantern had miraculously survived, though its light flickered precariously. Willow tried to calm her breathing, to push down the panic rising in her chest. She was alive. People would come. Her father would raise the alarm when she didn't return. She just needed to conserve her lantern oil and wait. Miles away, Yates Prescott rode his Palomino stallion along the eastern ridge overlooking Silver Creek. At 30, he'd spent half his life on horseback, working ranches from Texas to Montana before settling in Colorado 2 years earlier. The terrain suited him, rugged and honest, with enough challenges to keep a man sharp, but enough beauty to remind him why life was worth living. His black Stetson was pulled low against the afternoon sun as he surveyed the valley below. From this vantage point, he could see the sprawl of Silver Creek, the winding creek itself, and beyond that, the gaping mouth of Silver Peak Mine where men toiled to extract the precious ore that gave the town its name and purpose. A plume of dust rising from the mine entrance caught his attention. Even from this distance, he could tell something was wrong. The cloud was too big, too sudden for normal operations. Years of instinct kicked in and he urged his horse forward, descending the ridge at a controlled gallop. By the time Yates reached town, chaos had erupted. Men were running toward the mine, women were gathering on porches, voices raised in alarm. He dismounted outside the sheriff's office just as Sheriff Burke emerged, buckling his gun belt. "What happened?" Yates asked, falling into step beside the lawman. "Cave in at the mine," Burke answered grimly. "Don't know how bad yet, but they're saying at least a dozen men were inside, maybe more." "How can I help?" Burke gave him a measuring look. "You worked that silver mine in Nevada, didn't you, before you came here? 2 years in the Comstock." Yates nodded, memories of dark tunnels and close calls flashing through his mind. "Then come with me. We need men who know what they're doing." They arrived at the mine to find a crowd gathered. Miners who'd escaped or been outside during the collapse were organizing themselves, gathering tools, shouting instructions. The mine owner, a portly man named Harrison, was red-faced and sweating as he tried to maintain order. Yates was helping to clear debris near the entrance when a man staggered through the crowd, his face ashen with dust and blood. "My daughter?" he cried, his voice hoarse with desperation. "Willow, my daughter was in there." The crowd parted as Samuel Anderson, owner and editor of the Silver Creek Sentinel, approached the mine entrance. 2 men tried to hold him back, but he fought against their restraint. "Mr. Anderson," Sheriff Burke stepped forward, What was Willow doing in there? Working on a story, Anderson replied, his voice breaking. About the safety conditions. She went with Silas as a guide. They should have been out by now. A murmur ran through the crowd. Yates had seen Willow Anderson around town since his arrival, hard to miss, with her fiery hair and equally fiery disposition. They'd never exchanged more than passing greetings, but her articles in the local paper had impressed him with their intelligence and conviction. "We'll find her, Samuel," Burke promised, though his expression betrayed his uncertainty. As night fell, lanterns illuminated the grim work at the mine entrance. Yates had been digging alongside the miners, his back aching, hands raw despite his leather gloves. Progress was agonizingly slow. They had to shore up the tunnel as they cleared it, preventing further collapse. Around midnight, they reached the first victims. 3 miners, all dead, crushed beneath fallen beams. The bodies were removed with solemn reverence, carried out to waiting wagons. Among them was old Silas, his lifeless eyes staring at nothing, his body positioned as if he'd been running toward the entrance. "He was trying to get out," one of the miners said quietly. "Must have been near the front when it happened." Samuel Anderson, who had refused to leave, stepped forward. "What about Willow? Silas was supposed to be with her, if they were together." The miner didn't finish the grim thought. "They might have been separated," Yates said, stepping forward. He'd been studying the pattern of the collapse, the way the tunnel had given way. "Look at how he fell forward, not backward, like he was pushing someone ahead of him." A flicker of hope crossed Anderson's exhausted face. "You think she might still be alive?" Further in, Yates met the older man's gaze steadily. "I think it's possible, and I intend to find out." The rescue effort continued through the night, but many of the men were exhausted. By dawn, half the workers had been sent to rest, with fresh volunteers taking their places. Yates refused to leave, accepting only brief breaks to drink water and choke down some bread brought by townswomen who had set up a makeshift kitchen nearby. During one such break, as the sun climbed higher in the morning sky, Samuel Anderson approached him. "You've been at it all night," the newspaper man observed, offering Yates a cup of coffee. Yates accepted it gratefully, his throat parched from dust. "So have you. She's my daughter." Anderson's voice cracked slightly. "My only family since her mother passed, but you barely know her." Yates stared into the black coffee, considering his answer. "I know what it's like to be trapped, Mr. Anderson. Years ago in Nevada, 3 days in darkness before they reached me." He looked up, meeting the older man's gaze. "No one should have to endure that alone." Anderson nodded slowly. "Then I'm grateful she has someone like you searching for her." Yates returned to work with renewed determination. By midday, they had cleared another 30 feet of tunnel, finding 4 more miners, 2 dead, 2 injured but alive. The survivors reported that they'd been near a junction when the collapse occurred, and they'd heard voices further down the main shaft before everything went silent. "That could have been Willow," Anderson said, hope evident in his voice. Yates studied the crude map one of the miners had drawn in the dirt. If she was past this junction, heading toward the lower levels with Silas. He traced a path with his finger. "There's a chance she's in a pocket here where the support structures were newer." "Then that's where we dig," Sheriff Burke declared. The work grew more dangerous as they ventured deeper. Twice, minor collapses forced them to retreat and rethink their approach. The air grew thinner, hotter, laden with dust that coated throats and lungs. Men rotated in and out more frequently now, unable to sustain the punishing labor for long stretches. But Yates remained, his determination bordering on obsession. Something drove him beyond mere duty or compassion, a connection he couldn't explain, to a woman he barely knew but couldn't bear to abandon. As the second night fell, he was finally ordered to rest by the sheriff himself. "You're no good to her dead on your feet," Burke said firmly. 4 hours. "Get some sleep, then you can return." Reluctantly, Yates made his way to a tent that had been set up for the rescue workers. He lay down on a bedroll, his body screaming with fatigue, but his mind refused to quiet. Images of Willow Anderson kept appearing, her speaking passionately at a town meeting about railroad rates, her laughing with the baker's children outside the general store, her expression of polite interest, the one time they'd been properly introduced at a harvest dance. He must have dozed despite himself because he awoke with a start when someone shook his shoulder. It was a young boy, perhaps 12, his face smudged with dirt. "Mr. Prescott, they need you at the mine. They think they heard something." Yates was on his feet instantly, ignoring the protest of his sore muscles. Dawn was just breaking as he jogged back to the mine entrance. A crowd had gathered again, and he pushed his way through to where Samuel Anderson stood with Sheriff Burke and Harrison, the mine owner. What happened? Yates demanded. One of the men thought he heard tapping, Burke explained. 3 distinct raps, then a pause, then 3 more. Could be someone signaling. Where? Yates was already reaching for his gloves. "About 20 feet past where you were working yesterday," Harrison said, pointing to the mine entrance. "We've got men clearing the way now, but they reported another shifting of the ceiling. It's dangerous. I'll go." Yates was already moving toward the entrance. Samuel caught his arm. "I'm coming too. She's my daughter." Yates wanted to argue but could see the determination in the older man's eyes. He nodded once. "Stay close to me." Inside, the air was worse than before, thick with dust and the stench of fear and death. Oil lamps cast meager light as they made their way carefully through the partially cleared tunnel. They reached the team of miners who had been working ahead. 4 men slumped against the wall, exhausted. "We heard it again about 10 minutes ago," one of them said, his voice raspy. "Definitely someone tapping, coming from beyond that fall." He pointed to a wall of debris that blocked their path. Yates approached the wall, pressing his ear against a timber that protruded from the rubble. He closed his eyes, focusing all his attention on sounds beyond the creaking of the compromised tunnel. For several heartbeats, there was nothing. Then faint but unmistakable 3 distinct taps. "She's alive." He turned to Anderson, whose face transformed with hope. "She's alive, and she's smart enough to signal." They worked with renewed vigor, carefully removing rocks and splintered wood, passing the debris hand to hand down a line of men to be carried out. The ceiling groaned ominously several times, forcing them to pause and reinforce their progress with timbers brought from outside. Hours blended together in a haze of sweat and dust and desperate hope. By mid-afternoon of the second day since the collapse, they had cleared another 15 feet. The tapping had grown more frequent, sometimes in patterns of 3, sometimes irregular but always present, a lifeline connecting them to whoever waited beyond. "It has to be her," Anderson said during a brief water break. "My Willow learned Morse code 2 years ago. She insisted it would make her a better reporter." His eyes shone with pride despite the fear etched on his face. "She's always been too curious for her own good." Yates managed a small smile. "Sounds like a remarkable woman." "The most remarkable," Anderson agreed, "just like her mother. Stubborn as a mule but with a heart bigger than the Rockies." As they prepared to return to work, a terrifying sound stopped them, a low, rumbling groan from deep within the mountain, followed by a shower of dirt from above. "Everyone out," shouted Harrison. "The whole thing's coming down." Men scrambled toward the entrance, abandoning tools in their haste. Yates grabbed Anderson's arm, pulling him along as loose rocks began to fall around them. "No," Anderson resisted. "We can't leave her. We're no good to her dead." Yates shouted over the growing din, echoing Burke's words to him the night before. They had almost reached the junction when a massive crash sounded behind them. A cloud of dust billowed forward, enveloping them in choking darkness. Yates held tight to Anderson's arm, guiding them both toward the faint light ahead where the entrance would be. When they stumbled out into the late afternoon sunlight, coughing and gasping, they found the other men in similar states covered in dust, some bleeding from minor injuries. Harrison was on his knees, his face in his hands. "It's over," the mine owner said when he saw them. "That was the main support column. The whole middle section has probably collapsed now. No one could survive that." Samuel Anderson's face crumpled in despair. "He would have fallen if Yates hadn't caught him." "You don't know that," Yates said fiercely. "We heard her tapping. She was in a secure pocket. It could still be intact." "The risk is too great now," Harrison insisted. "I can't ask men to go back in there. It would be suicide." A murmur of agreement ran through the gathered miners. Many had families, responsibilities. They had already risked much for their fallen comrades. Yates looked at their exhausted, frightened faces and understood. Then he turned to Samuel Anderson. "I'm going back in," he said quietly. "Alone if necessary." "You can't," Burke protested. "Yates, be reasonable." "I survived 3 days in a collapsed mine once," Yates replied, his voice steady. "She's been in there too. If she's in an air pocket with access to water seeping through the rocks, she might have another day, maybe 2. "I'm not giving up on her," he turned to the miners. "I don't ask any of you to come with me, but I need tools, lanterns, and rope, and someone to man a pulley system at the entrance so I can send up debris." There was a long moment of silence. Then one of the miners stepped forward. "I'll man the pulley," he said. "My brother was saved from the Comstock collapse in '72. I owe it to someone else to try." Another man joined him. "I'll spell him when he needs rest." Within an hour, Yates was prepared to re-enter the mine. He had stripped down to his undershirt, suspenders holding up his work pants, a bandana tied around his nose and mouth. A rope was secured around his waist, connecting him to the pulley system that would allow him to send up buckets of debris and, if necessary, provide a lifeline if he needed to be pulled out quickly. Samuel Anderson clasped his hand before he entered. "Bring her back to me," he said simply. Yates nodded once and ducked into the darkness. The destruction was even worse than he had feared. The tunnel they had cleared was now partially collapsed again, requiring him to dig through several feet of new debris before reaching their previous position. The air was dangerously stale, and he had to work slowly to conserve his strength and the limited oxygen. By the time he reached the point where they'd heard the tapping, hours had passed. The new collapse had completely sealed the passage they'd been trying to clear. Yates sat back on his heels, considering his options. The tapping had come from somewhere beyond and slightly to the right. If the main tunnel was now impassable, perhaps there was another way around a ventilation shaft, a natural fissure, or an abandoned side tunnel. He moved back 20 feet and examined the walls carefully by lantern light. There a narrow opening partially obscured by a fallen timber. It looked like it might have been an exploratory tunnel, dug and then abandoned when it yielded no ore. Yates squeezed through the opening, finding himself in a cramped passage barely wide enough for his shoulders. He had to crouch uncomfortably as he made his way forward, the lantern held awkwardly ahead of him. The tunnel twisted and descended slightly, bringing him deeper into the mountain. After about 50 feet, he encountered another fall smaller this time, but still blocking his path. He began to clear it methodically, sending the debris back in small buckets attached to a secondary rope he'd brought with him. The work was painfully slow. His muscles screamed in protest, his lungs burned from the bad air, and the heat was almost unbearable. But the thought of Willow Anderson, alone in the darkness for 2 days now, drove him onward. As he worked, he found himself talking to her in his mind, making promises, sharing thoughts he'd never voiced before. It was strange, this connection to a woman he'd admired from afar but barely spoken to, yet it felt more real than anything he'd experienced in years. Deep into the night, as he cleared the last of the small collapse, a faint sound reached his ears. Not tapping this time, but something else, a voice. He extinguished his lantern and listened intently in the perfect darkness. "Hello." The sound was faint, weak, but unmistakably human. A woman's voice. "Is someone there, please? Anyone?" Yates's heart leaped. "Willow," he called, his voice echoing in the narrow passage. "Willow Anderson, can you hear me?" A pause then. "Yes, yes, I'm here." The voice was stronger now, infused with desperate hope. "Who's there?" "Yates Prescott," he answered, relighting his lantern and continuing to clear the remaining debris with renewed vigor. "I'm coming to get you. Are you hurt?" "Mr. Prescott, from the cattle operation north of town." She sounded confused. "My ankle's twisted, but otherwise I'm all right." "The air is getting bad, though. How long have I been here?" 2 days, he called back, working faster now. "Almost 3. Your father's outside waiting for you. The whole town's been searching." He heard what might have been a sob. I thought no one would find me. "I've been rationing my lantern oil, but it ran out hours ago, and the water I had is almost gone." "Keep talking," Yates encouraged her as he worked. "It helps me find you, and it'll help you stay awake." "What should I say?" Her voice was closer now, perhaps only a few yards away, through the remaining debris. "Anything. Tell me about yourself." Why were you in this mine in the first place? As he worked, Willow's voice guided him forward. She told him about her article exposing the dangerous conditions in the mine, about her mother who had died of fever 5 years earlier, about her dreams of someday writing for a big city newspaper like the Denver Post or even the Chicago Tribune. My father thinks I should be satisfied with our little sentinel, she said, her voice growing clearer as he made progress. He says a woman has no business chasing stories in dangerous places. I suppose this isn't helping my case. Yates chuckled despite his exhaustion. I'd say surviving a mine collapse shows considerable fortitude, Miss Anderson. Willow, please, she replied. I think we're beyond formalities when you're digging through a mountain to save me. Willow, he repeated, liking the feel of her name. I'm almost through. I can see a gap ahead. Indeed, his lantern light now shone through a small opening at the top of the debris wall. He cleared it enough to create a hole about a foot wide, then raised his lantern to peer through. The light revealed a pocket about 15 feet across, with a ceiling just high enough to stand. And there, huddled against the far wall, was Willow Anderson. Her once fine dress was torn and filthy, her auburn hair had come loose from its pins, and her face was streaked with dirt and dried tears. But her green eyes reflected the lantern light with a fierce determination that took his breath away. You came, she whispered, staring at him with wonder. I promised your father, he replied, working to widen the opening, and I'm not in the habit of breaking promises. Within minutes, he had cleared enough space to crawl through. He approached her carefully, mindful of potential injuries beyond the twisted ankle she'd mentioned. Up close, he could see the toll the ordeal had taken. Her lips were cracked from dehydration, dark circles shadowed her eyes, and she trembled slightly despite the warmth. Yet there was a dignity in her bearing, a resilience that impressed him deeply. Can you move? He asked, offering his canteen. She took it gratefully, sipping slowly as he'd instructed. Not well, my ankle. Yates examined it by lantern light. It was swollen but didn't appear broken. A bad sprain, he assessed. You're lucky. Lucky, she gave a weak laugh that turned into a cough. Is that what you call being trapped in a mine for 3 days? Lucky I found you. He met her gaze steadily. Many didn't make it, her expression sobered. Silas, Yates shook his head gently. I'm sorry, he died trying to get you to safety. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. He pushed me forward when the first tremors started. That's the only reason I ended up in this pocket instead of. She couldn't finish the thought. He was a brave man, Yates said. Now let's get you out of here. I've been digging for the better part of 3 days, and I think we could both use some fresh air and sunshine. He helped her to her feet, supporting her weight as she tested her injured ankle. She winced, but seemed determined to try walking. It'll be faster if I carry you, he suggested, noting her exhaustion. The passage is narrow in places, but I can manage. She hesitated only briefly before nodding. Thank you, Mr. Yates. I find I'm not quite as independent as I imagined myself to be. He lifted her carefully, one arm behind her back and the other under her knees. She was lighter than he expected, and she instinctively wrapped her arms around his neck for stability. The journey back was arduous. Yates had to set her down several times to navigate particularly difficult sections, then lift her again on the other side. The air grew worse as they went, and both were breathing heavily by the time they reached the main tunnel. Almost there, he encouraged as they approached the final stretch. Your father's waiting. The whole town's been keeping vigil. For me, she asked, sounding genuinely surprised. Even after I came in here against everyone's advice, especially then, Yates replied with a small smile. Silver Creek takes care of its own, even the stubborn ones. When they finally emerged into the pre-dawn light of the third day, a cheer went up from the crowd that had indeed maintained its vigil. Samuel Anderson pushed forward, tears streaming down his weathered face as he beheld his daughter, filthy and injured but alive. Yates gently transferred Willow into her father's embrace, stepping back as the town doctor rushed forward to examine her. He watched as father and daughter clung to each other, their reunion witnessed by the entire community. Only when Willow was being loaded into a wagon for transport to the doctor's house did she look back, her eyes seeking Yates in the crowd. Thank you, she mouthed silently, her gaze conveying more than words could express. He nodded once, touching the brim of the hat someone had returned to him, then watched as the wagon pulled away. An odd emptiness settled in his chest as she disappeared from view, as if something essential had been taken with her. Sheriff Burke approached, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "That was either the bravest or the most foolhardy thing I've ever seen, Prescott, probably both." "Just did what needed doing," Yates replied, suddenly aware of his bone-deep exhaustion. "Get some rest," Burke advised. "You've earned it." Yates nodded and headed toward his horse, which someone had thoughtfully brought down from the ridge where he'd left it 3 days earlier. The idea of riding all the way back to his small ranch seemed impossible in his current state, but the town's only hotel was likely full of miners displaced by the disaster. "Mr. Prescott?" Samuel Anderson's voice stopped him. The newspaper man hurried over, his expression earnest. "I insist you come stay at our home. It's the least I can do after what you've done for my family." Yates hesitated. "That's kind, but Miss Anderson needs rest, and she specifically asked that I bring you," Anderson interrupted. "Please, our home is modest but comfortable. You can have a proper bath, a hot meal, and a bed that doesn't involve sleeping on the ground." Put that way, the offer was impossible to refuse. Yates followed Anderson to his home, a 2-story clapboard house on the edge of town that also housed the newspaper office. The next few days passed in a blur of sleep, recovery, and quiet conversation. Willow was confined to bed rest by the doctor's orders, her sprained ankle elevated and wrapped tightly. Yates, after sleeping for nearly 15 hours straight, found himself reluctant to return to his lonely ranch. He told himself he was staying to help Samuel Anderson with repairs around the house, tasks the older man had neglected while consumed with the newspaper. But in truth, it was the moments spent in Willow's company that anchored him there. Each afternoon, he would bring tea to her room, then sit in the chair beside her bed as they talked. She was curious about his life before Silver Creek, the Texas ranch where he'd grown up, his time in the mines of Nevada, his dreams of someday owning a cattle operation large enough to supply beef to the growing cities of the West. In turn, she shared her ambitions as a writer, her frustration with the limitations placed on women, and her deep love for the mountains and valleys of Colorado. "I've had offers from newspapers back east," she confided on the 4th day, sitting up against her pillows, her hair braided simply over one shoulder. "Distant relatives in Boston who think I should return to civilization, as they call it." "But you stay," Yates observed, noting how the afternoon light caught the red highlights in her hair. "This is home," she replied simply. "These mountains, these people, even with all its rough edges and dangers, or perhaps because of them," she studied him thoughtfully. "I think you understand that," he did. It was the same pull that had brought him to Colorado after years of wandering, a sense of belonging he hadn't experienced since childhood. On the 5th day, when Willow was finally permitted to leave her bed and move about with the aid of crutches, Yates knew he could no longer justify his presence. His ranch hands, capable as they were, would be wondering at his extended absence. He found her in the small garden behind the house, seated on a bench beneath an apple tree, her injured foot propped on a stool. "Your father tells me you're healing well," he said, sitting beside her when she gestured to the space. "Well enough to drive him to distraction already," she replied with a smile. "He's threatened to lock me in my room if I try to go to the newspaper office before next week." Wise man. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the distant sounds of the town and the gentle rustle of leaves above. "You're leaving," she said finally, not a question but a statement. "I've imposed on your hospitality long enough," he acknowledged, "and my ranch needs attention." Willow nodded, her expression unreadable. "Will you come to town for the memorial service, for those lost in the mine?" "Of course." He hesitated, then added softly, "And perhaps I might call on you afterward, if that would be welcome." Her eyes, when they met his, held a warmth that stirred something long dormant in his chest. "It would be very welcome, Yates." The memorial service, held the following Sunday, brought the entire town together in shared grief and gratitude. 8 men had perished in the collapse, while 6, including Willow, had survived against the odds. The small church could not contain the crowd, so the service was held in the town square, where the minister spoke of sacrifice, community, and the bonds forged in adversity. Yates stood at the back of the gathering, hat in hand, watching as Willow laid flowers at the base of a hastily constructed monument bearing the names of the dead. She walked with a slight limp, but had discarded the crutches in favor of a simple cane. Her father stood proudly beside her, and Yates was struck again by her quiet dignity and strength. After the service, as the crowd dispersed to continue the day of remembrance with shared meals and companionship, Yates made his way to where Willow stood speaking with the widow of one of the miners. When she saw him approach, she excused herself and moved to meet him, her smile brightening her solemn features. "I'm glad you came," she said. "I said I would." He offered his arm, which she accepted gratefully, allowing him to ease the weight on her healing ankle. "I thought perhaps if you're not too tired, we might take a short walk. The day is fine." They strolled slowly along the main street, past shops closed in observance of the memorial, toward the small park at the edge of town. People nodded respectfully as they passed, many still thanking Yates for his role in the rescue. "You've become something of a local hero," Willow observed. He shook his head slightly. "I'm no hero, just stubborn." "A quality we apparently share," she replied with a wry smile. "Though my stubbornness nearly got me killed, while yours saved my life." They reached the park and found a bench overlooking the creek for which the town was named. The late spring sunshine warmed the air, and wildflowers dotted the grassy banks. "I've been thinking," Willow said after they had sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, "about what happens now." Yates glanced at her, noting the serious set of her features. "And what conclusions have you reached?" "That life is precious and uncertain." She met his gaze directly. "That waiting for someday is a luxury we may not have." His heart quickened at her words and the implication behind them. "What are you saying, Willow?" "I'm saying that I've spent 3 years writing about other people's lives instead of living my own." Her voice was steady, though a faint blush colored her cheeks. 3 days in darkness gave me time to consider what I truly want." "And what do you want?" he asked softly. "To know if the connection I felt when you called to me through the rock, when you carried me to safety, if that was real or merely a product of extraordinary circumstances." Yates took a deep breath, then reached for her hand, which rested on the bench between them. "It was real," he said simply. "Is real?" The smile that bloomed across her face was like sunrise after the longest night. "Then perhaps, Mr. Prescott, you might consider calling on me more regularly, for purposes other than checking on my recovery." "I believe that could be arranged, Miss Anderson." His thumb traced gentle circles on the back of her hand. "Perhaps beginning with supper at the hotel restaurant this evening, if your father wouldn't object." "My father," she said with a soft laugh, "has been singing your praises so consistently that I believe he would welcome you as a son-in-law tomorrow if you showed the slightest inclination." The word son-in-law hung between them, neither taking it back nor diminishing its significance. "That," Yates said carefully, "might be rushing things a bit, but I find I'm not opposed to the direction." The weeks that followed took on a rhythm that felt both new and somehow familiar, as if they were remembering a dance rather than learning one. Yates rode into town 3 times a week, dividing his time between business matters and increasingly lengthy visits with Willow. As her ankle healed, their outings expanded from sedate walks in the park to picnics by the creek, and eventually a horseback ride into the foothills, where Willow proved to be as capable a rider as she was a writer. By midsummer, their courtship was the subject of approving gossip throughout Silver Creek. Samuel Anderson made no secret of his pleasure at the match, though he pretended to grumble good-naturedly about losing his daughter's full attention at the newspaper. On a warm August evening, Yates arrived at the Anderson home earlier than expected, a nervous energy evident in his usually composed demeanor. He had spent the morning in Denver, returning with a small package that now weighed heavily in his pocket. Willow greeted him on the front porch where she had been reading in the fading light. "You're early," she observed, though her smile belied any criticism in the words. "I had a thought that wouldn't wait." he replied, extending his hand to help her up from her chair. Would you walk with me? There's something I'd like to show you. Curious, she set aside her book and took his hand. They walked in comfortable silence through town, heading not toward their usual haunts but in the direction of the Silver Peak mine. Yates, she questioned as their destination became apparent. Trust me, he said simply. The mine had been closed since the disaster, the entrance sealed with heavy timbers. A new shaft had been opened half a mile away, under different ownership, and with stricter safety measures changes directly influenced by Willow's articles, which had gained attention well beyond Silver Creek after her dramatic rescue. Yates led her not to the sealed entrance but to a small rise overlooking it. There he had arranged a blanket on the grass, with a basket containing wine, cheese, and fresh bread from the town bakery. What's all this? Willow asked as he guided her to sit. A commemoration, he answered, settling beside her. It's been exactly 3 months since the collapse, since I found you. She glanced toward the boarded mine entrance, then back at him. Most people would consider that a grim anniversary to celebrate. I see it differently. He uncorked the wine and poured 2 glasses. 3 months ago, I was a man content with solitude, convinced that was my natural state. Then a mountain fell down and everything changed. Willow accepted the glass he offered, her eyes never leaving his face. For me as well, she said softly. Though I might have preferred a less dramatic introduction. Yates smiled, reaching for her free hand. What happened was terrible. The men who died, the families shattered. I would undo it all if I could. His expression grew more serious. But I can't regret finding you, not ever. Nor I you, she whispered. He set down his glass and reached into his pocket, withdrawing the small box he'd carried from Denver. I had a speech prepared, he admitted. Something eloquent about how you brought light to my darkness, not just in that mine, but in my life. But now that we're here, I find simple truth serves better. He opened the box to reveal a ring, a modest diamond flanked by small sapphires set in silver. I love you, Willow Anderson. Will you marry me? Her eyes widened, then filled with tears that caught the light of the setting sun. Yes, she breathed. Yes, Yates, I will. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, she laughed suddenly. My father will be insufferably pleased with himself. He's been hinting about wedding plans since the day you carried me out of that mine. Smart man, your father, Yates murmured, drawing her close. Recognizes a good match when he sees one. Their kiss, tender and full of promise, was witnessed only by the mountains that had both separated and united them. The wedding took place in October, when the aspens had turned to gold and the mountains wore their first dusting of snow. The entire town turned out for the occasion, the church overflowing with well-wishers. Samuel Anderson, resplendent in his best suit, proudly walked his daughter down the aisle to where Yates waited, scarcely believing his good fortune. Willow wore a gown of ivory satin with lace at the collar and wrists ordered from Denver and altered by the town's seamstress. Her auburn hair was crowned with a wreath of late-blooming wildflowers, and she carried a bouquet of the same. But it was her smile, radiant with joy and certainty, that took Yates's breath away. Their vows were simple and heartfelt, spoken clearly for all to hear. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that rose from the congregation seemed to shake the very rafters. The celebration continued well into the evening at the town hall, with music and dancing, abundance of food, and more than a few emotional toasts from friends and neighbors who had witnessed their extraordinary courtship. Late in the night, as the festivities showed no sign of abating, Yates led his bride outside for a moment of quiet beneath the star-filled sky. Mrs. Prescott, he said, still savoring the sound of her new name. Are you happy? Immeasurably, she replied, nestling against him as he wrapped his coat around her shoulders against the autumn chill. Though I do have one concern, and what might that be? That the Sentinel's readers will miss my weekly column while we're away on our wedding trip. Yates laughed softly. I suspect they'll manage for 2 weeks, and if not, your father seemed quite proud of the young woman he's hired to assist in your absence. Miss Reynolds, Willow nodded. She has promise, though she's rather more interested in society news than investigative reporting. Perhaps that's for the best, he suggested. I'd prefer my wife not get herself trapped in any more dangerous situations if it's all the same to you." She tilted her head to look up at him, moonlight silvering her features. "I make no promises about avoiding danger entirely. But I do promise to always let you know where I'm going and to carry extra lantern oil." He kissed her then, beneath the vast Colorado sky, sealing their bargain with tenderness and passion. Their wedding trip took them to San Francisco, where Willow marveled at the bustling city and the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. They stayed in a grand hotel, dined in fine restaurants, and attended the theater experiences Yates might once have found frivolous, but now cherished for the delight they brought his wife. Yet it was their return to Silver Creek that felt most significant, coming home to the house Yates had expanded and improved during their engagement. Located midway between town and his ranch, it offered Willow convenient access to the newspaper office while giving them privacy and room to grow. The years that followed brought changes both expected and surprising. Willow continued her work at the Sentinel, eventually taking over as editor when Samuel decided to semi-retire. Her reputation as a journalist grew beyond Colorado, with occasional articles appearing in Denver and even Chicago publications. Yates's ranch prospered as well, expanding its operations to include not just cattle but also horses, which he bred and trained with exceptional skill. Their combined success allowed them comforts neither had expected in life, but their greatest wealth lay in their partnership and the family they created. Their first child, a son named Samuel after his grandfather, arrived just over a year after their wedding, a sturdy, curious boy with his mother's green eyes and his father's quiet determination. A daughter, Grace, followed 2 years later, and another son, Thomas, 2 years after that. Through it all, the sleepless nights with newborns, the challenges of balancing careers and family, the inevitable conflicts that arise between two strong-willed individuals, the foundation laid during those 3 days in the darkness of the mine never wavered. On the 5th anniversary of the collapse, they established a fund to support the families of miners injured or killed in accidents throughout Colorado. On the 10th, they helped finance a new school for Silver Creek, which had grown from a mining town to a prosperous community at the crossroads of ranching and commerce. And each year, on the anniversary of their engagement, they would return to the small rise overlooking the now abandoned mine, sometimes alone, sometimes with their children, to reflect on how a tragedy had led to their greatest blessing. On one such evening, as they watched their 3 children playing nearby, Samuel, now 11, and showing every sign of becoming a skilled rancher, Grace, 9, and already writing stories that impressed her mother and grandfather, Thomas, 7, and fascinated by everything mechanical, Willow leaned against Yates's shoulder with a contented sigh. "Did you ever imagine this?" she asked softly. "That day when you first heard my tapping through the rock?" He considered the question, his arm tightening around her waist. "No," he admitted. "I hoped only to find you alive. Everything since has been more than I dared dream." She turned in his embrace to face him, the lines of early motherhood and hard work etching her face but only adding character to her beauty. "When I was trapped, after my lantern went out, I spoke to you for hours in my mind, telling you to find me, promising things if only you would." "What sorts of promises?" he asked, intrigued by this confession. "That I would be braver, that I would live more fully, that I would open my heart if given the chance." Her smile was tender, tinged with memories of fear but overshadowed by gratitude. "You kept your part of a bargain you didn't even know we'd made. And you've kept yours," he assured her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Though I never found you lacking in courage, Willow Prescott." "Mama, Papa," Grace called, running toward them with something clutched in her hand. "Look what I found. It's a piece of silver ore, isn't it?" They examined her treasure, indeed a small piece of silver-bearing rock, likely washed down from the old mine over the years. "It's beautiful," Willow told her daughter, "a reminder of what lies beneath the surface, waiting to be discovered." As the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the valley, Yates gathered his family for the walk home. Samuel ran ahead, Thomas rode on his father's shoulders, and Grace walked between her parents, still proudly carrying her silver treasure. Willow's hand found Yates's as it had countless times over the years, their fingers intertwining with practiced ease. No words were needed. The journey that had begun in darkness continued in light, each day a new discovery, each year a deeper mine of shared joy. And if sometimes, in quiet moments, they remembered the terror and desperation of those 3 days, it only served to sweeten the life they had built from the rubble, a life neither had imagined, but both now knew was more precious than all the silver in Colorado's mountains.